All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming this afternoon. I'll do a brief introduction of myself, and then we'll dive into our topic for the day. We're done in an hour, and then dinner is served box lunch style at Exhibition Hall, from what I've been told. So I hope we'll have an interesting and productive hour together. So my name is Milton Friesen, and for the last 10 years, I've been part of a think tank based in Hamilton, Ontario, called Cardis. We work in Canada and the U.S., and we talk about taking 2,000 years of Christian social thought and applying that to the public square. In my case, the public square having to do with cities and institutions and the structural processes that give us the world around us. My background includes church planting. My wife and I, when we first left Bible college, worked for a time as a senior pastor, and then worked for the Billy Graham Association a number of years, managing communications for their national office, and then was recruited by Cardis to join their team. And I did that 10 years ago and have stuck with that since. So hang on a second here. I have to wrestle the mic. Part of my work includes just finishing a PhD in urban planning, so looking very seriously at cities, particularly the structural dynamics of cities, and trying to understand not only the pipes and wires and built parts, but also the human, social, the soft tissue of the city. That's my particular area of interest. And of course, it's endlessly complex, and we're going to talk about that today. So today's session is going to cover some of the elements of thinking about churches and faith institutions, not only as places of worship for the practice of those in them, but thinking about them in another dimension, not at the exclusion of that, but that they are also institutional citizens in the city. They have some kind of function. They own land, they have buildings, they hook up their wires and pipes like everybody else, and they occupy the dynamics of a city and its institutional landscape as well. So we're going to probe that today. I will say that the language, and I hope some of the concepts, although they may be new or different to you, that you will find them interesting and useful in your practical day-to-day work. But some of this is going to dive into some spaces like network science, network theory, but I won't use those sorts of any language that hopefully will be a barrier, but something you already know that you can add another layer to that will be useful for you. This is my A.W. Tozer caution slide. We're in Chicago. Tozer, I come from a Christian Missionary Alliance background. That's where we pastored. And Tozer's caution was, as you can see on the slide, program, technique, nervous busyness, appearance of mastery, religious zeal without Christ, anything that decreases dependence on God. And so I put here, what I share are literacies for us to think about and not sufficiencies. So as I'm talking about these things, I hope the theme you hear underneath it all is that by being good at these structural or institutional dynamics, this is not our panacea. This is not the solution that we need in a full sense. It's part of the dynamic. So it's an important literacy. It is not a sufficiency. So that sits underneath everything. You're going to hear me not talking so much about the theological implications of the gospel. I'm going to talk to you about the institutional structure of churches in their communities. So this is important, though, to say at the beginning. Learning to read may be a means to a deeper spiritual life, or it may be a distraction, Tozer said. So like the same is true looking at the sort of strategic structural parts. It could be a useful thing for you, or it could be a distraction. I'll leave that to you. All right, the working tensions for this talk are, there's a tension between the church and the city. So there's the church, a specific sort of instance, faith community with its own peculiarities, and there's the wider city it lives in. Those could be good tensions, they could be bad. There's a tension here as well today we're going to look at between research and application. We need to understand what's research for. It is to try to understand, to learn something, to see something differently, to perhaps appreciate a puzzle that we never appreciated before. And, of course, application is also important, but they're not two different things, but they should be held in a creative tension. So I think we need to be better at learning, even from a research side, about what's going on in cities as a means to further what we're doing. So that's the tension I'll try to hold. There's also tension between your particular community, your particular work, and the lens I'm going to share with you today. So I'm going to have to make some generalizations. I do not know your setting. I don't presume to know your setting. But I hope some of the things I say will be crossovers for you. And then I'm going to give you some useful simplifications on the one hand, and I'm also going to add in some necessary complications. I hope those are in a useful tension as well, that there's not too much of one or the other, but that they're in an interesting kind of space. These are the primary pieces I'll be dealing with. I'm going to be talking about social structures, institutions and organizations. I'm going to be giving you some examples. I'm going to think about at the end some congregational implications or church planting implications, and then we're going to have a Q&A. This is a piece of string. A piece of string is sort of interesting, could be potentially useful. When you take a string, however, and you start putting it together with other strings and arranging them in a certain pattern, the piece of string becomes eminently more useful. Here's another example. We start with a piece of yarn, or maybe a very long piece of yarn that's in a ball, and we begin to work at putting the piece of yarn together. This is purely accidental, but my wife, Michelle, is at the back, and she's actually knitting right now. This has never happened before, but she's knitting, and she's taking a long piece of string, which I have seen. It's just a ball with fall colors, and she's turning it through various complicated stitches and turns into something useful. A washcloth, I think, is what she's making right now. So between the string and, in this case, the mitten, something has to happen. There has to actually be some application of understanding and knowledge to make it work. So what does knitting or weaving mean in the social network context? The context in which faith communities live. They live in social environments, very social. This is what knitting or weaving looks like. It is about meeting, it's about organizing, it's about planning, protesting, supporting, researching, playing, praying, learning, eating, building. It's many, many things. So we think of knitting or weaving, our social sort of context, it's about all these things interacting together. Here are some of the social elements that we use. So the string, and then, that's just interesting in and of itself, as I noted. We could also take a solitary human being. A solitary human being does not have a social network. If you're the last person on earth, there's literally no one else, then you don't have any social network. You don't have one. You have to have other humans to have a network. This is the beginning of sort of some social structures. Some lumpiness starts to show up in the mix, in the recipe. So these are scattered social fragments. I'll explain a little bit more about this, but in network studies, network science, we often use arrows to depict the nature of the relationship. So if you look at the one structure where there's 4 people, the relationships are mutual, right? The one person in the center has got a relationship with everybody else, each has it with them. It's not all the way around that circle of 4 people, but there's both back and forth. If you look at the straight line, the 3 people, you can see that the person on the left's got a relationship to that person, but the one on the either end does not have a relationship with each other. So that's how these diagrams work, as we're trying to puzzle it out. And at the bottom is a simple 2 people who know each other. So in that case, dots and lines are further simplified, since when you try to do these diagrams, if you put actually human figures in them, they get kind of complicated and messy to work with. So we simplify, useful simplification. We take a human or some entity, make it a dot, and then we connect it with a line. So dots and lines, people and relationships. Some of you have probably seen this before if you've studied sociology, if you've looked at human kind of structured. This is a guy named Jacob Moreno. And Jacob Moreno was an early sociologist, early 20th century. And he had this interesting idea. He said, it's unique how people relate to each other. Not everybody relates to everybody else in the same way. Not everybody knows everybody else evenly. So Jacob Moreno said, I'm going to observe a bunch of people for a while and see who connects with who. This is not using Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter. This is Jacob Moreno with a piece of paper and a pencil, sitting for hours and hours and hours watching people, saying who connects to who. And he comes up after these many hours of observation with this network diagram. Some call it a sociogram. We just see it now as a social network. Guess what he was watching? Well, he was watching a playground. Anyone want to hazard a guess about what's going on in the playground? Grade 5 and 6 students. Grade 5, I think they were.
Boys and girls?
Yeah, boys and girls. Perfect, exactly. He watched this group out at recess, so they weren't in the structured environment of a classroom. They were free to associate with who they wanted. And Jacob Moreno discovered that this is how the network of the playground related. Boys and girls never mix except one brave soul. Somebody crossed. I don't know what the context is. I don't know what the relation is. Maybe it was a sister with a younger brother. She had to check in on him. That she didn't want to, but she had to. He observed one connection between the boys and girls on that playground. Anything else you observe about this network? A pair? Did someone say the pair? Okay, so there's a pair out there who know each other. Well, in his case, actually, he said he's only got the arrow going one way if you can see it, but there's a pair, and there's no connection anywhere else. So even though we don't know the playground and we don't know the context, we can begin to see some social dynamics, even with this useful simplification. That's hopefully the case. All right, here's a case of scattered. So scattered social fragments. Let's look a little bit more closely at that. If we take a group of people, a network of people, and we draw lines between the relationships, we can see that this network diagram, this map, contains many different kinds of social fragments. Extending the Jacob Moreno categories, we can see that there are some people who they're solitary. There's no ties, right? There's a couple of people here, no ties. We can see some networks where there's a person in the middle that connects to others, a kind of hub person who connects outward, but those people aren't necessarily all connected to each other. They're only through the center point. And then we have some pairings and some smaller structures like that. This is a case of scattered fragments. Here's what's interesting for us in our work. All network structures, depending on the structure, has some dynamic. When a network is fragmented, certain features show up, certain assumptions can be made, and certain patterns emerge. If we took that same network and said, let's imagine it's you and your community, and you've recognized that there are some people who connect well with each other, but they don't connect well with each other across the landscape. And you said to yourself, I'm going to do something about it. What would you do? That's you. Okay? And what you would begin to do if you're trying to connect across those networks is you would begin to form relationships, of course, with the different fragmented groups. So now we would have a network where you're the hub. You're the main person. What's the value of a hub? Well, a hub is probably better than this, right? A hub is better than the scattered social fragment. So it's beginning to thicken. It's beginning to kind of get more dense. The downside of the hub, of course, is that what happens if you leave? All you have to do to put this network back into its fragmented state is to get rid of the hub. And the network now falls apart. It goes back to its fragments. But social hubs can grow. So although we have the hub perhaps in the initial stages, there's you're still in the middle, and you still have a lot of connections to those networks. But those networks have now begun to connect to each other. Now if you remove the hub, the network won't fall apart. It will reduce its function, some things will change, but it will not fall apart. We would say that this network has become, in network language, it's become a smarter network, or it's become more resilient, it's become more durable, it's less prone to collapse, it's less vulnerable. If we go even further, there's a structure called a core periphery network. These are considered to be very durable, high performing. They have a lot of interesting features and characteristics about them. They look like this. There's a core that's very well connected with itself, with each other, and with the periphery. But you can take out any one of those blue squares, and the network's performance will change very little. But here's an interesting dynamic. The blue core is very connected with itself. If we look at this as an organization, this organization, the blue parts are very good at the functional operations. They're very good at getting things done, keeping things running. The periphery is very good at bringing in new things, connecting to new ideas, new people, new possibilities. So a core periphery is seen to be a balance of a steady operational core with this diversity around it. This is a tough network. These networks are hard to get rid of. These networks they last well. They have a lot of durability. So there we have sort of this evolution. You can talk about this again. This is a useful simplification. No network works precisely like this. But you have it where you've got a fragment, and we begin to put a hub in place, and that hub can start to connect across it. It may in time evolve to become a smart network or a core periphery network. Fragments, hub, multiple hubs, core, and periphery. Now, can somebody suggest to me some of the pros and cons of these different arrangements, these different stages or different structural parts? What would be a potential value of a fragmented network? Freedom of, okay. So they're autonomous, they're independent, each one can move. What if a disease entered one of the fragments? Is it going to spread to everyone? No, probably not, right? It's going to kind of just dead end. What if it's a bad idea? Is it going to go anywhere? No, just maybe within one part of the fragment. What if it's a brilliant idea? Same thing. It might not get very far. So the structure of the network has a lot to do with sort of what happens in and around it. Now, there's a hub. And what's good about a hub? Any ideas? What might be useful about having a hub network like that?
Everything comes there.
Everything gets there, right? It's all got a pathway to get from one part to another part through the hub.
Consistent message.
Yeah, see, hubs are great because hubs control the message. So if I wanted to announce to the world, or to this little world, what was going on, who's the one person I need to talk to? Talk to the hub. Everybody gets it. Now, if I was trying to infect that little world and make sure we got sick, who's the one person that needs to get infected? The hub, right? So in a sense, what we look at when we look at these network structures is they're not necessarily just good or bad. They have different dynamics attached to them, and it's a matter of sort of becoming better at understanding the different roles and functions they play. Multiple hubs, one of the things that happens in multiple hubs, what's going to happen to communication efficiency? It's going to decrease. It's tricky, right? There's no central control to hit everything. Yeah.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
Core periphery. You showed us the arrows prior to when you were talking about this. Is information or ideas always going out from the core to the periphery, or is there more of a mutual relationship there?
It is, of course, both hand, right? It's a bunch of those sorts of things. This is, again, just a sort of sketch simplification. But, yeah, it's a good question. Which way do the arrows go? I haven't really included much for arrows because it's just another complication in terms of the structure. But in an actual core periphery, it's never even. So every node doesn't have every arrow going both ways. This shows up in an interesting example. Let's say I went into your classroom when you're, let's say, in grade 12 or something like that, a typical classroom. And I said, I'm going to do a sociogram of the class. Who knows who's friends with who? And I gave you a list of all your classmates, and I said, put a name or a check beside all the people who are your friends. So, yeah, you go do that. And your friend, everybody else in the class is going to do the same thing. I say, I'm going to check and say, yeah, you're my friend. But then we look through the list and find out you didn't say you're my friend. So in that case, even though we're proximate, we have these things, the arrows don't necessarily always go both ways. So the arrows do contain new information, some kind of information about how that relationship is working itself out. In fact, my daughter was going to do this for her grade 10 class. We started working through the experiment, and then it became a very tricky question of who gets this information? And could you actually share it when you're done collecting it? And it's like, sure, it's simple. And then you start thinking about it, and you're like, no, actually, that probably wouldn't be a good idea, right? Within a grade 10 classroom in a public school to say who's friends with who and then let's show who's who. It's probably not a good idea. The same is true of corporations, ironically. Or corporations will have a nice org chart. This is the line of authority. This is how things work. This is how we structure ourselves. If you did an actual kind of analysis of what are the real social structures inside of that corporation, it'd be very, very interesting for you to see very quickly that it does not follow the org chart. There's a case in Germany of a company that did this and discovered there's this one guy who's super connected to everybody, and the immediate thought was, yeah, it's the CEO. No, that was not the CEO. The CEO was over here in a little cluster. This is Bob, the mail guy, and he knew everybody, and he connected to everybody. And so the executive's first thought was, we got to get rid of Bob. Like he's got tremendous connectivity inside the company. And the consultant said, no, you don't need to get rid of Bob. But you need to make sure Bob's got the best information you have because he's carrying it all over the place. So he's going to keep doing that, but you just make sure he's the one that gets the best information, the stuff that people need to know because he's moving around. He was the mail guy. Of course, makes sense, right? He's connecting much more laterally than the CEO was. So these things all have kind of important things. If we take a city or a community, we can layer these. So you can have the initial small network at the top, then we have clusters of networks, organizations, or groups. Then we have a whole population, could be thousands of people, different network structures and groups, and we could map that onto a physical space and actually say, where are these people, how do they connect, etc. You've all seen these examples on Facebook and things like that. Okay, so here's a question. We'll pause for us to kind of reflect on the congregational implications of this. Which scales do congregations do best at? Which, if we went back to this sort of structural scale, when we think of connecting people, when we think of bringing people into community. That's a very big word in church circles, right, is community. When we think of that kind of thing, in your experience, what would you say? What are we best at, typically? Are we best individual, sort of the person to person, these individual connections? Do we do good at the small group, sort of lumpiness level? Do we do good at the big group level, all of us in the same room together for services, things like that? Do we do good with families of churches? Do we do good with community organizations? So we start expanding this network out and think of the social structures of the city, or we think of the city's big institutional networks. There's different answers for different groups, but you can think about, just to kind of hold in your head, where do we typically play at this? I remember asking a prominent church leader in Canada. I was at a denominational executives group and I was leading a session, and I asked him, directly, I said, would it be fair to say that you are in the people business? This is kind of, in a crass, basic sort of way. Are you in the people business? And he was like, yeah, I think so. I think, yes, we deal with people. That's what we're about. I said, do you think you're really good at it? In fact, are you so good that businesses and people are lining up to say, how do you do it? How do you connect people? How do you do so great at like putting those pieces together? And he's kind of started chuckling. He's like, no, we do not. Like we are in the people business, but we don't really always know what to do with this or how this should work. Here's an old LinkedIn example. LinkedIn doesn't let you download your network anymore. There's some ways around that if you like, but this was an old one when LinkedIn still offered it. You could download your network, and the associated groups and organizations you were part of would show up. So this is quite old, but it was a sample of some different groups. So you could look at this and say, this is me, and you can see there's certain kinds of lumpiness, isn't there? There's information here about who I'm connecting with and all those sorts of things. And so these network diagrams give us information. In this case, the size of the dot also indicates sort of frequency of communication or intensity of communication. The colors indicate relative organizational affiliations. So all of these things. And then networks like this can be different algorithms can be applied to weight them in different ways to see other features that are kind of interesting. So I couldn't hold all this in my head. I know all these people, but when I start putting it into these structural diagrams and try to balance and figure out who fits with who, we quickly reach our cognitive limit. The tool is here that some of these tools can help us see the social structures around us or that are part of our world, and those can be useful. And of course, they can be troublesome. So this is just this is a type of a diagram that shows social groups all the way from the individual and the smallest group. And these data structures, so if we take millions and millions of people and look inside of them without knowing what they're part of, but just look for structures within social data, we tend to see breakdowns at these different sort of structural sizes. So there seems to be some kind of certain sizes of lumpiness that humans form when we are in and among each other's lives, when we live in common places. So I undertook a piece of research starting quite a few years ago where I was asking the question, what if we could get a better picture of the social structures of a city, in particular a neighborhood level? So I was hunting for an idea that said, you can see the buildings, I can see the pipes, I can see the roads, I can see where things are, but when I want to see what's going on in terms of the social connectivity of a city, it becomes much more difficult. And why is that? Well, I can look around this room and I have no idea which of you knows which other person, or for how long, or whether it's an adversarial or friendly relationship. You simply can't look at a group of people and see the tie. I can't see. So in a sense, the social infrastructure parts of it are just invisible. But invisible does not mean it's not there, and it doesn't mean it isn't powerful. Because if you start to probe those, just as I gave you about the grade 10 classroom example, if you start probing those invisible ties, things will show up. Really powerful dynamics will begin to emerge. And so even though we can't see them, they're really significant. And my research project was oriented towards trying to say, can we make them more visible? Can we see them? And so because you can't see these ties very easily, I started looking for a proxy. You can't measure the thing itself, so I looked to measure something I could measure that's near it. And so I thought, well, is there a relationship between how many relationships you have and the intensity of those relationships and how much you move around a city or around your neighborhood? What if there was a relationship? If you don't move around at all, that your social ties are low. If you move around a lot, your social ties are higher. Just a simple kind of hypothesis that I think if you move around a lot, they'll be higher. And I think if you don't move around at all, stay in your basement, never leave, you'll probably have fewer ties to the community, fewer ties to people, have less relational capital, less social capital. So I designed this study to look at the relationship between spatial structures and social data or social capital. It's a little bit like this. This is me in two different versions. So the first version is an X-ray, right? X-rays are done because they're really good at the hard structure. They're best in a way at kind of the bones, right? That was an initial use of them. They have other purposes, but they're really good at sort of the hard structural parts of our bodies. So if you want to know whether I have a fractured skull, X-ray is not a bad choice. If you want to know how the blood is moving around in my brain or as I'm thinking about different things, the X-ray is going to be very limited. It doesn't do good at soft tissue. what I was hunting for was that cities and city planning and people that work with sort of organizations were really good at the hard structure stuff. The pipes, the wires, the measurable, the tangible. What we're not so good at is the soft tissue. Enter the MRI. An MRI lets you see, this is me, side view, a little bit odd looking, but there it is, right? You can't see that in the other image, certainly not with that detail. And so the MRI let us see the soft tissue. And I would argue that when we're working with churches, there's the structural part, there's the visible, there's that this sort of X-ray mode, but there's this other mode. There's the soft connectivity, and it's really critical. We use MRIs today extensively. There's so many different kinds of MRIs to help us see dynamic, soft tissue, flow, all sorts of stuff that goes on that we couldn't get with an X-ray. Here's the problem. I tried to think about how would you get a city into a giant MRI machine? Because if we could do that, problem solved. We just get a giant super magnet, and we just sort of send the city through, get our image, and we're done. Right? But that was quickly rejected as infeasible. Can't get that in no matter how you try. So I started to put together an idea to say, okay, back to this idea of the social and the spatial. So what I did is I recruited 100 individuals, randomly sampled, and I had those individuals had to do two things. They had to answer a social capital survey that told me about their relational state, how many people they know, how many relatives do you have, how close are you, those sorts of questions. And those same people then carried a GPS device with them for a week. And so I would have from the same people that I had a measure of their social capital, I also had a measure of their spatial movements. Very unusual data set, very hard to get past Public University's Human Ethics Review panel. And very hard to convince people to participate, because they had to do both. If they only would take the survey but not the device, doesn't work. If they only take the device but don't take the survey, also doesn't work. So out of 6,500 and some odd phone calls from the marketing firm, the research firm I used to do the recruitment, I was able to get 150, but there was problems with a whole bunch of them, so I ended up with 97 after a lot of money spent trying to get that. Trying to find out, again, what's the relation, movement and social connectivity. This is an example of many people. It's interesting because this represents about 750,000 different GPS points. I did not constrain them to streets. I did not tell them where to go. I just put the dots on a blank piece, and you can see the street structures and other things emerge from that. It's kind of interesting, right? So clearly people are not running diagonally across cities, right? They're going on streets and roads. This shows up. This is interesting. This is a single individual. This is me over a 7-day period in the city of Hamilton. And this is my path. I wrote an article about this. There's some things at the back called Life on a Line. And it's about this. This is my life for 7 days. This isn't all my life, but this represents me moving through space. This is a unique spatial signature that I have. Now, let's go back to kind of our earlier question. One of the great challenges we face today is social isolation. It's an increasingly problematic public health issue. It's something we're seeing in people's sense of alienation. It's not the same everywhere. It's not equally applicable everywhere, but it is an issue. And one of the issues with social isolation is that we have this case where there's the lack of the connection's not there. It doesn't have to just be that they're not socially connected. They just don't feel connected. There's some sense in which an individual feels isolated. So the importance was to say, the whole Lundstedt study, if you haven't seen that study, it's probably not something you'd like to read except the first few paragraphs and the last 2 paragraphs, and what's in between is a bit tricky. But it's a meta-analytic study of hundreds of thousands of people across other studies brought together to ask the question of what's the relationship between social isolation and premature death. So if you're a socially isolated individual, will you die sooner at the same rate, live longer than someone else? And the whole Lundstedt study showed that if you are a socially isolated adult, that you will die at about the same rate as if you had heart disease or smoked or were exposed to stroke risks. In other words, people who are isolated die sooner. There's a linkage there. They found this interesting correlation. The second correlation they found was interesting, that the number of American adults over the last 20 years that say they have no significant confidant, no trusted other person that they would regularly communicate, has gone up 2 to 3 times. So between 2 and 3 times. So despite social connectivity through media, whatever forms we have available to us. I'm not suggesting they're the cause, but they're also clearly not the cure. So whatever else is going on, we see a significant increase in people's disconnection, and it has a health effect. Why is this useful? I'll get to your question. It is because for some people, they think the soft tissue stuff isn't that important. When you talk to policy people, when you're talking about budgets and government and business, it's like the soft tissue stuff isn't that critical. The stuff church planters do, not that critical. I would argue it says here that if you don't care about people at all, but you have to manage a budget that relates to some sort of public dollars or public health, you better pay attention to this. And the question will be whether or not we have the means to actually begin to change that back the other direction. Yes?
That confidant statistic, is that relative to population growth, or is that just, because obviously our population is growing?
Yeah, no, corrected for, things like, corrected for population growth over that period of time. Yeah.
What was that study?
Holt-Lundstedt. Yeah, I can... There's ways to, it's easy to find those things. Please see me after. I can jot some things down for you. Happy to give it to you. But very important. A lot of work's been done since then. That came out in 2010. And it's gaining popularity. You've got some U.S. senators, for instance, they're doing social isolation studies out of Utah, places like that, Mike Lee. And so it's becoming a more apparent sort of structure. When you have millions of data points, again, this is kind of just the nature of trying to parse this. If you have millions of data points, you can't process it, so we use tools. This is a research program in R that's written to actually parse a whole bunch of that data and show the relationships between all these variables. So these aren't things that church planners are typically using or looking at, but I think it's interesting that when we probe into something like relational spaces, we quickly see that I put the slide up for one reason, which is only to say what we already know. They're very complex. Even very significant simplifications lead us into sort of very tricky weeds, very difficult kind of conceptual spaces. Okay, let's look at some implications for the local church as an institutional city. Seeking the good of the secular city. Now, I wasn't sure if I should call it seeking the good of the secular city or seeking the good of the structural city, but secular city. And secular, I mean sort of small s secular, just the parts of the city that are not a church. They're not bad, they're not worse, they're just the parts of the city that are not the church itself. We'll call that's part of the secular city. First of all, I think there are some framing disciplines that we can bring to our work that could be helpful for us. Again, not the only ones. These are just pieces I think are important. One of them is increasing our literacy around city planning. City planning is not something most people are terribly interested in. If there are public consultations for changes in zoning in your neighborhood, I bet you don't go, and for good reason. They're not always that interesting. But there's something really unique about city planning, which is if you're interested in the long-term structural strategies and implications of a city, then city planning is where you need to spend some time. What we build now will have an influence for decades, even centuries. The neighborhood you live in was planned, thought of, and executed, for most of us, long before we got there. And it will continue to shape human social and other kinds of interactions for a very, very long time. So this isn't the case for church planters to become city planners. It's just to say that the structural shape of the city makes your work easier or more difficult. It doesn't determine it fully. It does make it easier or more difficult. Some urban forms and shapes lend themselves to better connectivity, more efficient use of resources, and some do not. And once they are set, they are very, very difficult to change. So we have lots of training in urban ministry, suburban ministry training, those sorts of things, very critical. We have less on the city structural training. I'm not suggesting we need to make these equal, but I would put a little box over on that side to say it's not irrelevant for us to be spending some time thinking about those questions. Some of the things, imagine this. You want to change human trafficking. You want to stop human trafficking. So you work hard, you do everything you can to say, I'm going to interfere with that, we're going to stop that, we're going to expose it, we're going to make it go away. What if, however, all of the social structural, the banking institutions, the informal economy, the black market that's going, what if all that stuff that supports it is being, in a sense, made possible by things like, if I scooted back, to things like social isolation and fragmentation? I can try to fight it sort of on a point-by-point basis. But if the tidal flow is that we're more isolated and more vulnerable, if our institutions are more exploitative of people, and I don't attend to that, all I'm doing is sort of trying to hit those points where it first shows up. I may spend a great deal of time trying to do that, and it may actually not get better. So we do need triage. We need interventions. But there's a percentage of us, some rind around the orange, who need to think about the tactical, structural implications and begin to learn the vocabularies and the processes in those spaces to try to leverage the kind of change we need. It will actually help those who are doing the frontline triage if we can move some of the structural pieces into the proper places. So that's my appeal on that. Second, when we think about changing social structures, we are dealing, as I noted already, with something that's very complex. Being a student of dynamics, I would argue, is important. We need to think the human structural systems we're part of are not linear. They don't go 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. They don't work like that. They start in one direction, we think we have them figured out, and they end up somewhere else. And one of the things that we may have experienced, I don't know if you have, I have, is why your plan may fail while your work flourishes. So it can go two ways. Your great plan fails and you just fail. But sometimes your great plan fails and a different thing pops up and it turns out to have been the best thing that happened to you. The question is we usually can't fully explain why that happened. And this is the domain of this emerging sort of new science of complex systems. It's not that new, but it's been gaining a lot of traction. And it helps us understand that when we're working for social change, when we're working with people in institutional structural spaces, that simple kind of linear thinking is seldom useful. But it requires a retraining because we tend to be, a couple of steps out and that's it. And we don't have an ability to see the larger influences of systems. I'm going to explain a little bit more about that. Okay, so those are a couple of what I called framing disciplines. Those are just a couple to flag for you. Now we're going to switch and do the quick slap chop tour. People, places, and relatedness. And this will become, I hope, a little more illustrative for those of you that like pictures and something simple. Jan Gehl wrote, he's been very influential, this architect from Europe, very good at designing spaces for people. He and his wife became excellent students of watching people in physical spaces in cities and saying what works and what doesn't. You want to create human spaces for people. This works and that doesn't. There he is, smiling, great guy. If you have a chance to hear him, he's well worth looking at. They noticed 4 different kinds. It doesn't matter if there's 4, but let's just say there's 4 different kinds of sort of social distances. So think about this. The first one is the intimate distance, 0 to 18 inches. Okay, the top image, a little kiss on the cheek, 2 siblings there. That's the intimate distance. The second distance, 18 inches to 4 feet. They watched enough people that they got these sort of distances actually, and these are pretty close. Once you get these, you'll see them happening all the time. 18 inches to 4 feet is personal distance. If you come up and chat with me, it'll probably be personal distance. Not likely intimate distance, and probably not social distance. It is now social distance, but when you come to talk to somebody, you move across a boundary, right? You go from this to this. And then, some cases it goes to the other. Social distance, 4 to 12 feet. So that's a circle of people sitting around the park, somebody hanging out, a group of coworkers sitting around having a coffee break. So that's sort of social distance. And then he talks about, the last one is 12 feet, the public distance. Most of us are public distance, sort of a public forum, large group. That's what we have. The interesting thing is all of these distances require different kinds of they have spatial implications. So you can see with the workers, that social distance, what have they done? They've created a little ad hoc set of shipping crates or their trays to create kind of the right distance for them to have that right social. So you watch this. We are very good at this. We don't even have to think about it. And of course, you recognize some cultures put these lines in different places. But nonetheless, they're always there. These distances always mean something. Okay? That's why if we look at the distance in the top image, okay, these 3 images, these are all human scale distances, like in a city, on a street, in a landscape. These are human scale distances. They let us cruise through kind of different areas and we feel like they're manageable to us, right? We can get in and we like them. We actually go to these places much more regularly. The bottom one, So living arrangement, so there's a little more space, but still, human distance. Anyone want to speculate about the sociability of these spaces? Jan Gale and his wife, they observed these kinds of spaces, and though they were carefully designed by architects who put people into the landscape in happy little groups, wandering around on their drawings and on their marketing materials, but there's something about humans which is, the scale here is far too large. There's far too much open space. There's nowhere to sit. There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to stop. Studies would show that if you and I meet each other in a large open square, even if we know each other, if we meet in a large open square, the amount of time we spend talking will be measurably shorter than if we bumped into each other in a bookstore or cafe or some other small street. Because there's a kind of feeling around us with the space. This is a place to go through. This is not a place to stay. And so there's a language and a literacy about these spaces. These are structural questions. Here's some other examples he gives of different cities, different squares, different places where in the bottom, in fact, there's circles drawn around the humans. They're so tiny. The proportion is so massive that, of course, you might see them as a spectacle, but these are not places you spend time. You go through them if you must, but you don't spend time. These are efforts where we try to increase the sociability of spaces by looking at how we design them, create room for us to be within that 4 to 12 foot space, not the public space or the isolation space, which would be the way farther away. Okay, a few more examples. He provides these, which he says, look at the top one. I've made these notes here. The one is socially sterile and the other is socially generative. So if we want some language around this, we look for spaces that are socially generative, and we tend to avoid places that are socially sterile. So even though the architects and designers put in a bench and a nice little garbage can there, and there's benches over there, there's a little water feature, it's so open, it's just not a place that humans tend to go. It's not made for humans. It's not a space for humans. And because humans aren't in it, the social part is not there either. So these are antisocial spaces. They just don't work for us. On the bottom, however, you can see these markets. There's interesting things to see. People are sort of proximate to each other, and they are much more populated. He says, test yourself this way. Think of the places in the world, the cities of the world, or the locations of your own city that people like to be. What are the most crowded and busy spots? And he says, you will invariably find the spaces are typically much more spatially appropriate to that sort of human interaction. We like human spaces. We naturally gravitate to them. Why do we go to Venice? It's narrow streets, crowded, it's compact. It's really interesting, and it's chock full. It's permeated by human space. It's all human space, largely. So we like those places. We pay more for them. We want to live near them or in them. We do not want to live outside that office building with the lonely bench. Okay, we can skip over that slide. There's just a quick thing to say that I think this is really important, is that we don't have to look at the whole diagram, but we used to live in houses that were a third the size they are now, if we go back to the 50s, and had twice as many people in them. So a third, 2/3 smaller, and we have 2 to 3 times more people in them. Now we're much bigger, 2,400 square feet per person on average, something like that. And there are half as many people in that space. So you think, these structural functions don't matter, but if you add a bunch of the pieces together and recognize we have cities whose buildings are more dense, Chicago has more built density, but its human density is lower than it would have been in 1910, 20, 30, 40. Because we are spread out. In some cities, between 1/2 and 3/4 of every apartment and every house you drive past may contain one person. So when I think about the loss of life, you think about the human misery that was represented by things like social isolation. And we see how the things we're designing and building are going to continue to contribute to that for a long time. They don't cause it in its entirety. They are a contributor that tips it in that direction. You can see that we often are fighting uphill. When I was a church planter, I often remarked that one of my biggest challenges that I faced was trying to build an actual community. Not just a congregation that gathers on Sunday mornings, but a community where interdependencies actually happen, where life happens together. It's extremely difficult. It's gotten no easier. I think it's more difficult than it ever has been. But this is just a general structural social change that's happened. Twice as much space, or 3 times the space, and half as many people in it. It does something to us. It's very important to watch those things. He's got a documentary called The Human Scale. Really worth watching. He gives some case studies from different places, different cities of the world, showing how existing spaces can be transformed. Really encouraging, hopeful. He doesn't talk about churches, but when I watch something like that, I kind of think if every church planter could see this, they would feel inspired. They would go, we could do some of this. Like, we could get better at this. We can help with this. This is our business. This is what we do. We connect people, not just on the commercial side, but we do it because we have some other really important things we think need to happen. Got an article, some of the back, called Habits of Engagement, Reweaving a Good City. Those are 2 different articles. In Habits of Engagement, I challenge the church to think of itself as an institutional citizen and to think about what that might mean for them. Reweaving a Good City says we don't need more in our cities. We just need to better connect what we already have. We don't need to put a greater burden on our resources and say, well, we've got to tear it all down and rebuild it. It's like, no, we need to better use what we already have. Reweaving a good city. So it's not a pressure to say I've got more to do. It's just I have this. Can I connect it? Go back to the network weaving side. If I've got fragments, I don't need to add more into it necessarily. I can better connect what I already have, whether that's people or resources or even the institutional networks we might be part of in denominations or within our community, etc. Okay, I'm going to go through this quickly so we have some time for Q&A. A couple of observations and some more resources for you. Number 1, as institutional citizens, congregations are uniquely valuable. I'm going to show you why, okay? So I'll let you look at that for a second if you're jotting down notes. Congregations are uniquely valuable. Here's why. We did a project called the Halo Report. The Halo Report was a report that took Ram Kanan's work out of the University of Pennsylvania. He had this thought of saying, if we took congregations in this area of Philadelphia, they took about a dozen or so, and he said to himself, what if we applied typical economic development measures to these institutions and asked what effect are they having on their community? The kind of economic development measures you do if you had like a flower show or a dog show, like the knock-on effects, or what they call halo effects. So people, they spend money going out to dinner, they spend money in hotels. So they actually, this is normal. We calculate this at an urban planning level to say what's the impact. He said, well, let's apply it to congregations. And he and his team discovered that roughly for every $1 in a church's budget, so if your church has a $100,000 budget, and if something happened, doesn't matter what happened, let's just say your church and all of its functions suddenly disappeared, okay? And the city had to put back all the common good generation that went on in that place, it would cost them about $4 to $5 per your annual budget dollar to do it. It cost them 4 to 5 times as much to replace that. Okay? I'm not saying that your church is like General Motors producing cars and generating GDP. No. It's a quality of life common good contribution that says if you remove it, and someone else has got to pick up the slack so quality of life doesn't drop, it's going to cost you about $4.77 on every dollar the church has in its annual budget as a rough marker. They figured that out. We did it in Canada with another dozen or so congregations in Toronto and came up with a similar figure. And so we're continuing to sort of push this forward in Canada. I've developed a Halo calculator which uses publicly available tax data. So you can put in any community in Canada and it'll tell you the Halo effect. It'll tell you how many religious congregations there are, what their annual budgets are, and then it'll give you the Halo effect calculation. It's not a way to say that's what they're worth, but when you're sitting at a city council table and they want to look at what's happening in the community, city councilors that want their cities to be better, or mayors that want their cities to be better, should be asking, how do we get more churches? We need more of these things. These are socially generative. Remember, socially sterile, socially generative. These are socially generative spaces. They don't necessarily know that they're that. That's not why they exist. In fact, Ram Kanan shares the story of visiting with one pastor, and he said, I was talking to him, and the guy said, well, we really don't do any social programs. We don't know much in the community. And Ram's like, yeah, but there's people lined up outside. He goes, yeah, well, Tuesdays we do a grocery thing. That's. And he says, yeah, but there's some other people in the office. He goes, yeah, we have AA meetings. They're meeting. So Ram's like, I was asking him about their sort of, what they're doing in terms of serving the community. He was kind of thinking, wow, our congregation's small. There's only 50 people. We don't do much. And he's like, no, you're doing all this. And when Ram took it and said, let's take these 50 measures add up all these small pieces, what do they look like, and they become tremendously significant. So it's not the end of the story. We need more research in that space, but it's a really critical kind of insight into the fact that when we start putting value on these, we can see that they're really quite critical. This is a for-profit firm that I do some consulting work with. They're developing something called City IQ, which is trying to measure a whole range of things across the city, including the role that faith groups play or religious entities play in contributing to the overall value of a city. And I share the slide to show that not only would church planting or faith-related people be interested, there's tremendous interest in trying to understand the social dynamics of our communities and the importance they play in our other aspirations for quality of life. Very critical, and people investing in it. Here's another possibility, or second issue. As institutional citizens, congregations are weakly connected to their peers. We do not have a lot of good second-tier structural relations that connect faith communities or congregations to each other. We have ministerials, we have some denominational things, we have some area interests, but very little sustained structural engagement. I've been seeing this for a long time, met with lots of people across Canada, U.S. So I proposed this thing called a Chamber of Registered Religious Charities. What if we had a new piece of infrastructure based on a Chamber of Commerce, but it's for registered religious charities? If the government recognizes you as such, doesn't matter what you believe or what you think, as an institutional citizen, you could join this group and have a sustained regular amount of executive director. You have somebody who's consistently engaging with the city, so it's not just piecemeal. This is just there's examples of thinking about how do we thicken up the weave, how do we thicken the social infrastructure and perhaps build new forms of social infrastructure. So we've done a feasibility report. There's some at the back for you. There's draft on them. Pretend it's all written in pencil, but you'll get the idea of what we're trying to do in proposing the possibility that if you're going to engage the city structurally, you can't do it as a solitary entity. You must find ways to structurally speak the language of the city administration, the city planning, and some of the other agencies that are so influential in our cities. You can't do it on a one-to-one basis. It's like 120 volt versus 220. They run in a different way. And so we need some new ideas and some new collaborative spaces that are able to attend to this. As institutional citizens, congregations are hit and miss with the city. And so we tend to interact with the city if we have parking issues, we have building, zoning issues. We either get those solved in our favor or not, and then we go back to our business and don't talk to the city anymore. The city tends to think of us the same way. They don't really know how to deal with us. They don't know how to invite people into meetings. So rather than bother with that or offend somebody, we have to invite everybody or nobody. They usually choose nobody. So we need to find ways to weave across the gap. If you look at the top picture, you'll see there's fragments. And then on the side, there's the city planning side, which is administratively strong, professionalized, funded. We need to figure out how, as you move down the diagram, to bring the faith-based organizations into closer proximity with some of these structural people. And there's ways to do it. As institutional citizens, this I'll wrap up here with this, congregations are thinking deeper. These are some important people. David Bosch, missiologist. Often we think of missiology as happening cross-culturally or another part of the world. We need it for our own communities, to tap into the theological and doctrinal substance of what's happening in missiological studies. We need to read novels. Marilyn Robinson, if you haven't read Gilead, the story of this pastor in this, no consequence place. The novelists are telling us some of the things we need to understand about what's going on in the human heart and soul and how to connect. We need to think about using, and cities are rich with the resources of the arts and the things that help us actually understand the human dilemma. Max Stackhouse, the pastor, is public theologian. This doesn't mean you become a politician. It means instead that there's a mature institutional presence and a posture in a city, and we don't pretend there isn't. We work at getting better at that, and people like Max Stackhouse can help us craft some of those ideas and help us think through those dynamics. Jane Jacobs, urban planners know her well. The Death and Life of Great American Cities. If you don't care about planning, you just are interested in people, you must read Jane Jacobs. It's not about city planning. It's about our human cultural situation. A brilliant woman. She's no longer with us. There she is in all her glory, just smiling like a grandmotherly figure. But if you read her work, she's very spicy and she's very strong. And underneath those goggly glasses lies an incredibly bright mind that was very prescient about what's gone wrong with some of the structural functions of our city. She can help us lead the way back. She's very important. She's read somewhat, understood very little, and practiced even less. But there are places where it's happening, and she's very important. Christopher Alexander, another kind of moppy-haired guy, but also very brilliant. A city is not a tree. He means a logic tree, not a green growing tree. And it's a 7,000-word essay, but a brilliant analysis of how we try to simplify things for our own comfort, and in doing so, dramatically reduce their performance, their function, and their humanness. Really great guy. Finally, Charles Fensham, public missiologist, building off some of Jane Jacobs' work, Emerging from the Dark Age Ahead. A really brilliant book about what's happening in the dynamics of the theological and the cultural within our cities. And Jamie Smith, a colleague of mine, some of you know Jamie's work, Cultural Liturgies, another way to access what's happening around us, the larger patterns that shape so much of what we do. And without that kind of insight and understanding, it's going to be very hard for us to do anything more than randomly be successful. And so we have to think more carefully about that. I'm going to skip over this example at the end quickly, but this is the entrance to a church I did a case study for. And I said to them after showing them the Jan Gale idea of human spaces, things that look welcoming, things that say I'd like to hang out here. I said, this is the entrance to your church. And their motto on their sign, if you got back far enough in the weeds to read it, was, everyone's welcome. But when we look at the spatial structural signals being sent by something like this, I said, this is not your fault. The city built this design. You took your plot. You built your church. But if you're in the people business and you're about connecting and you're about your community, this is saying everything the opposite. There's things you can do to repair it, but this is what you have now. And if we don't understand these dynamics, we can put a tremendous amount of effort trying to go up a hill that is be better for us just to figure out how to get the angle running the other direction. Okay, lots of other tools and resources. I'm happy to share this with you. I'll open up for questions as we get near the end of our time. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate that. Oh, sorry. Yep.
So back to the Halo project and Halo calculator.
Yep.
There's a question about that. If a church is $5 value.
Yep.
Does that take into account both churches with buildings and churches without?
Yep.
Could you say a word about how that might?
That's right. Those of you need to leave too. Please feel free. Just back doors open there.
Can you repeat the question?
The question was, what if you don't have a church building, or what does it all include or not include? What they did is have a list of between 40 and 50 measures, like capital, so your building, your property, how much green space is there, what kind of programs do you offer, how many people do you employ, a whole bunch of those kinds of things. If there was they didn't have a building, then that's zero in that category. So it's, and in the report itself at the back, it's got the matrix of the questions that of what was asked and probed, what those budget elements looked like, and what was concluded from them. So in lots of cases, you'll see in the appendix, there's lots of zeros because some churches didn't have that program. Some had gardens, some didn't. Some had playground spaces, some didn't. So it takes, that's what those measures. And they didn't make up any of those measures. Those are all from kind of the typical economic development tools. They're all pre-existing tools. They just turned it as a lens onto an entity that never gets looked at that way. So, yep, there and then here.
I have a question. You showed a picture. I was actually thinking about this before you showed
Yeah.
it, but most models for church ministry today include some kind of a commuter model where it's still a card-dependent culture,
Yeah.
mostly on an exurb model.
Yeah.
How would you suggest the church reshape some of our habits related to vehicle and travel to
Yeah.
our places of ministry?
Yeah, the truth is 80% of us still live in suburbs. Like it or not. I mean, in Canada, that's the number. It's much the same in the U.S. So we aren't going to change, we're not going to reform, that percentage, even if it's half of us. How are we ever going to do that? We wouldn't ever put anybody if we all left the suburbs. So clearly that's not going to work. However, places like the Congress for New Urbanism and other places have done significant work on, they have a sprawl repair toolkit. They're not thinking of churches, but they're thinking of spatial design that's better for people, how do we make use of what's already there and get better at doing it. So I think the church, this is a clear case where, to an extent, you can't change the big patterns. A church plant cannot change the big patterns. But it can be aware of those patterns, what they do, and then figure out, in some cases, how to mitigate, other cases, how to bypass, and others maybe how to take advantage of them. There can be good in those dynamics that we aren't aware of. And you see, I can give you some examples, but so I think we can't change the basic reality that suburbs are still prominent, but we could do better at understanding how to work with the dynamic and recognize their power. It's a powerful form, for good or ill. It does a lot of things. Here, and then we'll go over there.
Oh, I was just following up on the Halo calculator question. Because from the city's point of view, churches are a drain. Oftentimes because they don't pay property taxes, they don't pay income taxes, and they tend to be insulated. Do you subtract for those things? I was just curious.
No, we say again the question.
Opportunity cost, because if it wasn't for a church, it would be a business there that could contribute to something else.
So there's other directions to take the calculation, but what this answers is things when I was in budget meetings as a counselor and would come up like that, and you would say, well, no, they're kind of good, they should be there, but you don't have anything pragmatic to say about them. I would say now in those cases, and I've been at many trade shows and stuff where I've talked to mayors and counselors, and I'd say, well, fine, if you don't want them, let's say you want to tax them, or you want to put extra burdens on them because you don't think they're carrying their share. But if there's 50% less of them in your community in 10 years, your quality of life in that community will be lower because you can't possibly afford to fill the gap. The reality is municipalities are so cash strapped that you can say it costs them $4.70 per dollar, but they would never afford that. It just means quality of life will diminish. And in fact, we're building some suburbs and other places with no provision for any religious institutional space. And I would say the long-term prognosis for those communities is that it's going to be difficult. They're going to face uphill battles. So whether it's $4.77 or $2.77 or whether we've calculated everything in, it is in a sense kind of illustrative of the point that they're not, you can't just automatically say it's negative. We put a pin in the board to say, no, it's positive. If you want to provide counter evidence, great. Let's talk about it. We need more research on these groups. And there's clearly not enough done. Ram's a leading pioneer. I asked him when I met with him years ago. I said, who else is doing this? He says, nobody. We're leading the edge. And Ram himself is not a person of faith. But he just has studied them and said, these are remarkable entities in the landscape. What are these things? Well, they're these congregations. So it's quite interesting, actually, to see that develop. So where did I say we'd go? Oh, yeah, there. Yeah, and then.
Just a comment. I'm a former city planner, now a pastor, and I would say among my colleagues, and so this is more of an exhortation, this stuff, learning just even a little bit of this, helps you avoid accidentally encouraging actions by your city that will have long-term negative consequences. So knowing even a little bit of this, just reading one of these things, would help you when you are in a meeting for some other random reason to not accidentally encourage something that will have long-term negative consequences. It's just a really useful lens.
I would also suggest that I think most of the people that should be involved in these structural strategic things aren't the pastor. I think in all of your groups there is that one or two people who, like myself, have a certain nerd gene along the line that just need to be released to go and say, pay attention to this for us. I'm not suggesting you need to do this. In fact, I would argue, find someone else. Somebody around you gets really excited thinking about this stuff. It might be strange. I mean, there's people around me who don't really, this is odd stuff. Why do you like doing this? I don't know, but I do, and I think it's important. So just encourage you, I think, along that somebody needs to be literate. You don't all need to be literate. We don't all need to be doing this. But somebody needs to be, and that could be a really valuable piece in the puzzle. Yeah.
My question was right along the lines of that last
statement.
Okay. Kind of take it one more level down to ground level. What does this look like in a local congregation? So whether it's on the training, and you were talking about structural city planning kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Do you run members through a training, or do you bring someone in to do some kind of training? Do you, you talk about having one nerd person going at it, but do you actually dig that more into sort of leadership life and how you're thinking and how you're investing in the city? Because it seems like it would take a sort of a shift in perspective.
I'll just give one example, which is in one community, after about 2 or 3 years of meetings with planning people and various pastoral leaders and multi-faith, so across the board, I had enough trust with them I could bring them together, and we did an evening called Planning in Good Faith. And I had some planners present, this is Planning 101. This is what planners do. It's a really complicated job. It's a very difficult job. It's a thankless job. We have 50 bosses and 50 experts we have to coordinate, and most of the time, this is what we do. These are the laws. These are the acts we have to follow. This is all the stuff, the legal requirements, etc. And then I had the pastoral side present, this is Faith 101 for the planning side to say, congregations and faith communities are not the same as a business, or they're not the same as the arts group. They're not the same. They have there are some commonalities, but they're also kind of odd creatures as well. And here's what's beautifully odd about them, right? Just tell us. So that was one example where bringing a network of them together kind of was fine. Within a congregation or church plant, I think it's the beginning of just that, even the early literacy of just thinking about how does the space around it speaks some sort of, it's talking, it's telling us something, it's helping our mission or it's hindering our mission, but just maybe being more attentive even to the space around us. You know, at a congregation level, you can't change a lot, but you can change your space, you can change your position, even your location. You know, where congregation members live is about the most important vote they're going to make in their life. We don't think that's that significant. It is. Very few things you do will matter as much as where you choose to buy a house or where you choose to live. So those are a couple. It's not a great thorough answer, but a few things for you. Yeah.
This is just a comment, but what you can't do physically, you can also do relationally. So I'm a Moody church person, and our building manager, he would go out and he would introduce himself to every one of these shops and stores and businesses in this community.
Yeah.
And when we were going to have a large event that was going to put pressure on parking and put pressure on service, he would go out, he would give them tickets and invite them. And so then when we needed something one time from our government and we went, and they gave it to us without even blinking. And you know why? They said, every morning we would go out and we had people sweeping the streets in front of our. We didn't give two thoughts to that.
No.
But so it was a relational thing that we didn't do structurally.
One of the resources I skipped by is a book by June Hawley called The Network Weaver's Handbook. The person you're describing is what she would call is this network weaver. And these can happen not only locally but institutionally. People who are just good at being the connectors. And it's a tremendously relational space, all of this. I started with the social on purpose. These are not just sort of policy structural things. Even the policy side, deeply relational. And that's a great example. That has huge implications there, and then we'll go there.
I regret I just got in, so I missed the whole seminar.
Okay, we'll start over. Okay, back to slide 1. Here we go, everybody.
The question is, our church is urban, but our congregation is suburban.
Yeah.
How do we get them to see the city, to care of the city? Maybe you covered that already.
Well, one thing I did at one congregation we were at downtown was to just take the addresses of all the members and create a map and put that onto Google. And they kept talking about we're a neighborhood church, and it's like just put that map up and said we may serve this neighborhood, we may have ministries in this neighborhood. We are not a neighborhood church. Nobody lives within 5 miles of here. So it used to be they were a neighborhood church, right? People now zero. There was, I think we were the closest, and we were like 4 or 5 miles away. Like it's just so it was sort of truth telling to say, let's just be honest. We're ministering in this neighborhood, but we're not. This is not a neighborhood church.
We're not yet ministering in the neighborhood. We need to have our
You're right.
suburban congregation embrace this vision.
And a part of it is talking to people about what if you want a better life. We need to actually be closer to each other. Now, it's not just for the sake of our neighborhood, but we actually won't be a real congregation, a real community of faith, if we only ever see each other on Sunday mornings and we never bump it. Like that can't work. It works to a point, but that's not a real community. So I think actually people want more. So you're not selling. I think they just need a pathway often to say, what if a church, how often, it rarely happens, the church says, we need a bunch of you to move a lot closer. We need you to move into this neighborhood. Now, there are ministries and movements that way, but it's not uncommon to say where you live matters. So, encourage them to do that. Yeah.
I don't know if in your resolution, differences on how these can be applied, I guess, and from like the large church versus the small church plan focusing. I'm just I'm listening to you. I'm thinking. So, for example, I don't know. It's like Redeemer things. Redeemer probably has connections with the larger city structures because of how big they are.
Yeah.
But the small church plan, kind of how you do it bottom up instead of top down.
I think it has nothing to do with size. At whatever size you are, there is something that you might do that sort of engages with your city structurally. Simple as sweeping this stuff in front of a business, or doing something in the community that's missing. Some communities, they start with a service model and say, what's missing in this community? There's no playground. What if we built a playground? I don't know. So that's not changing the whole city, but it's a structural piece, right? It's actually. So I would just say I think our responses are always in scale to the size of who we are. And if we're too small and there's a bigger problem, then we have to find other small pieces. and we build that network and we create that structural density to now we can interact with that thing, right? So I think we can move that all the way up through the scales, and that's because there's no one size fits all for any of this, and Redeemer would be the same. If you talk to them, look at their trajectory on different ministries, you'd see how they've grown that way too. Little piece here.